we've got lives and I've got children, and the effort that we put in, because we work really hard.
For decades, fans believed the Beatles were a brotherhood. Four young men bonded by music, fame, and a cultural revolution the world had never seen before. But behind the smiles, the interviews, and the carefully managed public image, there was a hidden fracture no one talked about. And at the center of it was a growing resentment that nearly tore the band apart long before they ever announced their breakup. Ringo Starr, the quiet, soft-spoken drummer who rarely showed anger in public, carried a private bitterness toward Paul McCartney, a bitterness that didn't fade with time, success, or reunion attempts. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about talent. It was something far more personal, something that turned admiration into frustration and friendship into silence. What most fans don't know is that the tension didn't begin during the breakup. It began years before, while the band was still in full control of the music world. And when the final conflict happened, the one moment that made Ringo walk out of the studio and refuse to return, even the other Beatles admitted they had never seen him so furious. Ringo wasn't loud, dramatic, or explosive. He was calm, until he wasn't. And when he finally reached his limit with Paul, he didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply packed his bags, left a note, and disappeared. The media never printed the real story. The band never fully explained it, and Paul himself later admitted that Ringo had every right to be angry. But what exactly pushed the Beatles' most peaceful member to the breaking point? That's the untold truth, and it changes everything fans thought they knew about the band. The Beatles were the symbol of unity, friendship, and musical perfection. Fans saw four young men smiling in interviews, playing in perfect rhythm, and conquering the world together as if nothing could ever come between them. But behind the cameras, behind the carefully staged photos, and behind the records that changed music forever, there was a growing silence that no one outside the studio walls ever heard. And that silence belonged to Ringo Starr, the man who was always expected to laugh, play along, and never complain, until the day he finally broke. From the very beginning, the spotlight favored John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They were the songwriting geniuses, the voices of the band, the faces that sold the records. George had his own quiet brilliance. But Ringo, he was the drummer people joked about. Reporters asked why he was even in the band. Critics said they could replace him any time. And while Ringo smiled through all of it, the truth was that the disrespect went deeper than anyone imagined, because it wasn't just the public who made him feel invisible. It was happening inside the band, too. The moment that changed everything happened during the exhausting sessions for the White Album. Tensions were already high. The band members were drifting apart. Arguments were becoming normal. And in the middle of that chaos, Paul started taking control in a way that pushed everyone away, but Ringo most of all. Paul began telling others how to play, how to sing, and how the songs should sound. He wasn't just giving suggestions. He was issuing instructions. Even when it came to the one instrument Ringo had full command over, Paul acted as if he knew better. And with every take, every correction, and every dismissive tone, something inside Ringo began to collapse. One day, in the middle of a studio session, Ringo realized he didn't feel like part of the band anymore. He felt like a hired musician, a replaceable tool, a background piece in a group that was supposed to be built on brotherhood. And instead of fighting, shouting, or demanding respect, he stood up quietly, looked at the others, and said words no one expected from the most patient member of the group. "I'm not good enough. I'm leaving." Then he walked out. No one stopped him. No one begged him to stay. No one ran after him. Ringo left believing what the world often hinted at, that he didn't really matter. He took a break from London, stayed on a boat for days, and waited for someone to call him back. But the most painful thing wasn't leaving. It was finding out what happened after he left. Paul didn't just continue recording. He sat down at the drum kit and started playing the parts himself. He took over the drums on tracks that were supposed to belong to Ringo. In the band that was meant to stand as equals, Ringo was replaced within hours. And that was the moment the hurt became something much deeper. That was the moment resentment turned into a wound that never quite healed. When Ringo finally returned, the band acted normal, but the trust was gone. Friendship turned into silence. Respect turned into memory. And when people later asked Ringo which Beatles member he struggled with the most, he didn't hide it. He didn't mention John's temper or George's bitterness. He said Paul because Paul was the one who treated him like he was expendable. Paul was the one who took his instrument. Paul was the one who didn't seem to care if Ringo vanished from the band forever. The world always saw Paul as the charming genius, the talented songwriter, the legend who helped shape music. But Ringo saw something different. He saw a man who could smile at the cameras while quietly making his own friends feel small. And in that moment, the world's greatest band was no longer a family. It was a battle of ego, silence, and unspoken betrayal, one that lasted long after the music stopped. After Ringo returned to the studio, the band tried to pretend everything was fine, but everyone felt the shift. The laughter wasn't the same. The music didn't feel like a shared creation anymore. And while fans believed the Beatles broke apart because of business arguments, jealousy, or outside influences, the real fracture began in moments like these: quiet betrayals, silent wounds, and friendships held together only by contracts and public pressure. Ringo smiled for the cameras, kept time on the drums, and acted like nothing was wrong. But inside he could still feel the moment Paul took his place and recorded without him. That wasn't just a musical decision. That was a message. A message that said, "You're optional." What made it worse was how the world kept praising Paul as the peaceful one, the polite one, the good Beatle. While John was labeled rebellious and George was seen as distant, Paul was treated like the calm diplomat of the group. But behind the scenes, Paul had become the most controlling figure in the room. He wasn't trying to destroy the band, but he was trying to run it like a machine. And in that machine, emotions didn't matter. Only results did. Paul wanted perfection. He wanted songs done his way. And if someone got hurt in the process, that wasn't his concern. Ringo wasn't the only one who felt this shift. Even George Harrison had reached a breaking point after Paul kept interrupting his guitar parts, telling him how to play like he was a school student instead of a world-class musician. George eventually snapped, saying, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." But while George fought back, Ringo internalized the pain. He was the peacekeeper, the one who held the band together emotionally, the one who never walked into a room expecting a fight. And ironically, that made him the easiest one to push aside. The more Paul took control, the more Ringo faded into the background, not just publicly, but personally. He wasn't asked for opinions. He wasn't included in decisions. Even song credits turned into battles, because Paul had begun positioning himself as the true leader of the Beatles, as if the others were lucky to be included in his vision. Ringo, who had always been the steady heartbeat of the band, was treated like a drummer for hire instead of a founding member who helped build the legacy that made them global legends. By the time the band reached the Let It Be sessions, the emotional distance was impossible to hide. Cameras captured the tension. Voices were quieter, eyes avoided each other, smiles became forced. Ringo didn't explode. He didn't lash out, but he looked tired. Tired of being overshadowed, tired of pretending that everything was still built on love, tired of watching Paul act like the Beatles belonged to him alone. The man who once brought joy to every rehearsal now felt like a shadow standing in the same room where history was being written. Even after the breakup, the pain didn't fade. When the world celebrated Paul's solo success, Ringo congratulated him publicly. But the hurt stayed underneath, because the world never knew the full truth. They didn't see the nights Ringo spent wondering why he was never treated as an equal. They didn't see the way Paul acted like the band would have survived with or without its drummer, as if rhythm didn't matter in the greatest rock group ever formed. And the most tragic part? Ringo never asked to be worshipped. He only wanted to be respected. Decades later, when Ringo finally opened up about the breakup in interviews, there was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. He said he loved Paul, but he also admitted there were years he couldn't stand him. Years where he wanted nothing to do with him, and he didn't deny it anymore. There was a time when the one Beatle he resented the most was Paul McCartney. Not because Paul was successful, not because Paul was talented, but because Paul forgot what being in a band meant. A band was supposed to be a family, and in the end, he made Ringo feel like a passenger on a train that used to belong to all of them, and the world never saw it, because Ringo hid his pain. behind a smile that fans assumed was genuine. Even after the Beatles officially broke up, the tension between Ringo and Paul didn't vanish overnight. While the public celebrated their individual successes, behind the scenes there was an unspoken distance that no reunion, interview, or public appearance could ever erase. Ringo threw himself into his solo career, exploring his own music, producing albums, and collaborating with other artists. But even in these projects, the shadow of Paul's dominance lingered. Every time Ringo stepped into a studio, memories of that moment in the White Album sessions haunted him. The moment Paul decided that the drums he had played for years could be replaced by someone else's touch. The moment he realized that respect in the band was no longer mutual. It wasn't just professional frustration. The bitterness became personal. Friends noticed that Ringo had grown more guarded in interviews, less willing to discuss Paul in detail, and he rarely mentioned the band without carefully controlling his words. Behind his trademark humor and charm was a lingering resentment, a quiet fury that refused to surface publicly. He often admitted privately that while he loved Paul as a friend, there were times he truly hated him. Not for jealousy, not for fame, but for the betrayal of trust. In Ringo's eyes, Paul had taken something sacred, a relationship, a brotherhood, and reduced it to power, control, and perfection at the expense of those who had helped build it. The resentment simmered through years of collaborations, charity events, and even casual reunions. Ringo would participate in Beatles-related projects when necessary, but he never allowed Paul to overshadow him again. The quiet tension was palpable. Insiders recalled moments during recording sessions and photo shoots where Ringo's distance was unmistakable. He didn't need to argue or fight. His absence spoke louder than words. And the world still assumed everything was fine, still celebrated Paul's leadership, still glorified the band as a perfect unity, completely unaware that the drummer who had held the rhythm together had quietly nursed a decades-long frustration. Even when they finally appeared together at high-profile events, the dynamic had shifted. Ringo would smile, nod politely, and play along, but he never fully trusted the situation. There was always a careful balance, a mutual understanding that history had changed them forever. The camaraderie that once existed was replaced with respect tinged with wariness. And in interviews, when asked about Paul, Ringo would speak carefully, choosing words that were truthful but controlled, never fully revealing the storm beneath the surface. Over time, fans began to speculate, noticing subtle interactions, reading between the lines and piecing together hints from interviews and biographies. The truth slowly emerged. Ringo Starr, the beloved gentle drummer of the Beatles, had harbored real resentment toward Paul McCartney. It wasn't constant, it wasn't always explosive, but it was real, and it shaped the way Ringo approached his music, his collaborations, and his life after the Beatles. He had forgiven in part, but he had not forgotten. The wound remained, quietly reminding him of the day a friendship, a partnership, and a band that had changed the world fractured in a single moment, leaving a lingering tension that never fully healed. As the years passed, Ringo Starr carved out his own path, one that was separate from the shadows of the Beatles and the lingering tension with Paul McCartney. He embraced his solo career fully, releasing albums, touring, and collaborating with artists who respected him as more than just the drummer in a legendary band. Every note he played, every song he wrote, carried a sense of personal freedom that had been denied during the height of Beatlemania. He no longer needed validation from Paul or anyone else. He had discovered that his talent, humor, and unique voice were enough to define his own legacy. Even as fans speculated about Beatles reunions or the possibility of healed friendships, Ringo remained cautious. The truth was that some moments could never truly be erased. The silence, the subtle bitterness, and the quiet heartbreak from years of feeling undervalued were always there, simmering beneath his calm exterior. And yet, instead of letting anger consume him, Ringo transformed that pain into art, laughter, and resilience. He became the embodiment of someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and even hurt by those closest to him, and turned it into a life and career defined by dignity, creativity, and independence. The public rarely saw the full story. Interviews would hint at disagreements, subtle jokes would suggest tension, but the reality was far deeper. Ringo had loved Paul like a brother, trusted him like a bandmate, and counted on him as a friend. But when trust was broken, when control and ego overshadowed respect, Ringo made a choice that would shape his life forever. He refused to allow resentment to define him, but he also refused to pretend the hurt didn't exist. That quiet strength, that ability to forgive without forgetting, became his most remarkable quality. Over time, Ringo's relationship with Paul evolved into a fragile respect. They would meet, exchange pleasantries, and even collaborate on rare occasions, but the shadow of the past was never fully lifted. The drummer who once walked away from the studio in frustration had grown into a man who could navigate decades of history, fame, and personal betrayal with grace. He had survived the very thing that could have broken him, and in doing so, he earned a respect far beyond what the world had ever acknowledged. The story of Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney is not just about conflict, ego, or fame. It is about the quiet heartbreak of feeling invisible when the world thinks you are part of something eternal. It is about the courage to walk away from someone you once loved when their actions betray trust. And it is about the triumph of carving your own path, even in the shadow of a legend. Ringo may have truly hated Paul in certain moments, but he also learned that hate could be transformed into wisdom, resilience, and creative freedom. And in the end, that is the legacy of the man who kept the beat for the greatest band in history. He survived, he thrived, and he turned pain into art, proving that even in the world's brightest spotlight, true strength often lies in what you choose to leave behind.